Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now let's begin. I remember that night so clearly, more vividly than most memories from my time at university. I was living in a student house in Leeds, in 2017, a basement room at the back of a row of terraced houses. It wasn't a great place by any stretch. The room was small, a narrow rectangle with a single bed shoved into the corner, a threadbare carpet that never quite dried after winter rain, and a window that was flush with the garden outside. The walls were thin, the floorboards above creaked like they were about to collapse, and the house had that lingering smell of damp and stale cooking that never seemed to go away. But for a student on a budget, it was fine. I didn't spend much time there anyway, except to sleep and shower. My favorite thing about that house, though, was the bathroom. The shower was small, but it was hot, almost absurdly hot if you left it running long enough. After long library sessions, late into the night, I would retreat to the bathroom, close the door, and lose myself in the steam and heat. The walls would fog over, the mirror would disappear behind a layer of condensation, and for those few minutes, I could convince myself the world outside didn't exist. That night, it must have been around 2 a.m. I was alone in the house. My flatmates were either out drinking or at friends' houses, leaving me to my own devices. I had my phone with me, sitting on the edge of the bathtub, music playing through the tiny Bluetooth speaker I had smuggled into the bathroom. The songs were low, just enough to keep me company, the kind of thing that made the room feel like my own private sanctuary. The fan hummed quietly above me, a constant white noise that blended with the sound of the water. I had been standing under the hot stream for what felt like half an hour, letting the heat push away the stress of assignments, deadlines, and exams. The mirror was completely fogged, the tiles slick with steam, and the air was thick enough that my hair clung to my neck and shoulders in wet strands. I turned the water off, letting the last droplets run down my body. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was the air, the sound of the fan rattling slightly in the duct, maybe the way the house groaned in the cold night. But then it came again, sharper, clearer. It was a hiss, breathy and deliberate, and it was coming from the ventilation grill right above the shower head. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, standing there dripping, water running down my arms. I strained my ears, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just the house settling, just the fan. But it wasn't. The hiss came again, longer this time, higher pitched, almost like someone was laughing through it, holding back the sound, trying not to be heard. It wasn't words, nothing I could make sense of. Just the sound of lips, almost pressing against the slats of the metal grill, whispering. My pulse hammered in my ears. I stepped closer to the shower, tilting my head up, trying to see if there was anything in the vent, any sign of what could be making the sound. The hiss stopped immediately, replaced by a soft scrape, the sound of something moving inside the duct. It was retreating, moving toward the wall that connected our house to the next one over. I froze, unsure what to do. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a rat. Maybe the old ductwork had shifted. Maybe the fan had loosened and something inside was brushing against it. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the creaks and groans of an old house. But then the scrape came again, quieter this time, deliberate, like something, or someone, was moving just out of sight. I backed out of the shower slowly, letting the water drip onto the floor. My towel was on the radiator, just out of reach. Every step I took seemed to echo too loudly, bouncing off the tiles, bouncing off the walls. I grabbed the towel and wrapped it around myself, my fingers trembling slightly as I did. The bathroom suddenly felt small, claustrophobic, like the walls were closing in. I listened again. Silence, except for the fan. My breath was loud in my ears, my heart still hammering. I told myself I needed to leave the room, to go check the house. The idea of staying there alone, with the vent making that sound, was unbearable. I needed to be somewhere safe, anywhere but that bathroom. I stepped out into the corridor. The house was silent. No music, no chatter, no footsteps. The floorboards creaked under my wet feet, each squeak a reminder that I was completely exposed. I moved toward the living room, trying to be calm, to convince myself it was just a rat, just a fluke, just the house settling. But as I passed the kitchen, I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow sliding across the wall near the back door. I stopped dead. My mind jumped straight to the worst-case scenario. Someone had gotten into the house. Someone had been in the vents, in the ductwork, listening while I was showering. I swallowed hard, trying not to panic. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light, the shadow from the street lamp outside flickering through the window. But I knew it wasn't. I grabbed the phone off the coffee table and switched on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the living room, the hallway, the kitchen. Nothing. Everything was exactly as it should be. No sign of forced entry, no footprints, no dropped items. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every vent in the house, every creaking floorboard, every whisper of air seemed amplified. My eyes kept darting to the ceiling, to the ducts, to the corners where shadows pooled. My rational mind told me I was being paranoid, that nothing had actually happened, that I was safe. But the instinct in my chest screamed otherwise. I spent the next hour walking through the house, checking doors, windows, cupboards. Everything was locked, everything was in place. I even went upstairs, peering into empty rooms, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Nothing. The house was empty. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The sound of the vent in the bathroom replayed over and over in my mind. The hiss, the scrape, the movement toward the shared wall. I began to consider the possibility that someone had actually crawled through the ventilation, the old ductwork connecting our house to the neighboring property. Maybe they had been listening, maybe watching, maybe waiting for the right moment. The thought made my stomach churn, made my hands shake, made me realize that I had never felt truly vulnerable until that night. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep through the back windows, I had decided I wasn't staying in the house alone any longer. I packed a small bag with essentials, wallet, phone, charger, and left quietly, taking care not to make a sound. The street outside was deserted, wet from a late spring rain. I walked the few miles to a friend's house, still wrapped in the towel from the shower, still dripping. They were asleep when I arrived, and I didn't want to wake anyone. I sat in the kitchen, phone in hand, trying to rationalize the night. I told myself that it had to be a coincidence, that I had been imagining things, that stress and exhaustion had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. Someone had been in that vent, and they had been listening. I didn't go back to that basement room for another week. When I did, I brought a friend with me. We tore down the bathroom vent, piece by piece, looking for signs of entry, signs that someone had been inside. There was nothing concrete. No fingerprints, no hairs, no marks. Just the empty duct, the old metal, the same fan humming in place. But I knew. I knew what I had heard. The scrape of movement, the hiss of breath, the retreating sound toward the neighboring wall. Someone had been there, someone who could have come into the house, who could have crawled through the ventilation, who had been listening when I was at my most vulnerable. The thought of it still makes my skin crawl, even years later. I moved out of that house shortly after. Found a different place, ground floor this time, with no shared walls and no basement. I never used that shower alone again at night. The memory of the vent, the hiss, the scrape, stayed with me for a long time. It changed the way I thought about safety, about being alone, about trusting the space around me. Every time I hear a fan hum, every time I hear metal shift, I remember that night in Leeds, standing in the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, realizing that the world can be much closer than you think, and that some threats aren't visible, aren't loud, aren't immediate, but they are real. Eventually, I came to terms with it. I couldn't prove anything had happened, couldn't explain the noises, but I accepted the reality that someone had been in the vents, and that I had narrowly avoided a confrontation I wasn't prepared for. I learned to lock doors, to check my surroundings, to trust my instincts even when logic told me otherwise. That basement room became a lesson in vigilance, in awareness, in the thin line between comfort and danger. I never saw anyone, never heard anything else after that night, and the vent stayed silent. But the memory didn't fade. It stayed with me, a quiet warning, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones you can't see, the ones that hide in the ordinary spaces you think are safe, waiting for the moment when you're alone. Years later, I still think about it every time I stay in an old house, every time I take a hot shower alone. I can feel the hiss, hear the scrape, and remember the way my heart raced in that tiny basement bathroom in Leeds. It was real, and it changed me forever. I arrived at the townhouse just past 11 in the evening, the kind of late that makes the city feel quieter, as if it were holding its breath. The complex itself was tidy and gated, the beige walls of the townhouses blending together under the dim streetlights. I parked my car close to the unit, swung my backpack onto my shoulder, and took a moment to look up at the two-story building. It was the same townhouse my coworker had described, and though I had been in the neighborhood before, seeing it empty, quiet, and still in person was different. The air smelled faintly of wet concrete from an earlier rain, mixed with the faint perfume of cedar from the landscaping. I approached the front door, where the keypad lock glowed faintly green in the dark. The numbers seemed oddly reassuring in their familiarity. I punched in 4-8-2-0, and the lock clicked open. I stepped inside, feeling the quiet swallow me immediately. The interior smelled faintly of cinnamon and laundry detergent, a homely, lived-in scent. I dropped my bag by the door, checked that the doors were locked behind me, and made my way upstairs to the living area where the TV and a small couch awaited. The upstairs space was modest but comfortable, with a window that overlooked the back alley between the townhouses. I made myself a quick cup of tea and settled on the couch with my laptop, scrolling through Netflix titles. The hours passed quickly. By the time I noticed the clock, it was 1:15 a.m. The quiet was heavy but not unsettling yet. The kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft buzz of distant streetlights outside. Then I heard it. The keypad downstairs beeped. 4 quick presses. Beep, 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 beep. My heart stuttered. I froze mid-sip of tea, straining my ears. The sound repeated. Again. Beep, 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 beep. Pause. Then a muffled curse, low and guttural, almost swallowed by the walls. My stomach twisted. Someone was trying the lock. I could feel the pulse of fear in my chest, radiating out to every fingertip. My hand shook as I set the mug down, and I realized I could hear my own heartbeat so loudly that it drowned out everything else. I slid off the couch and edged toward the top of the stairs. Through the banister, I could see the faint green glow of the keypad lighting up again. The beeps came at irregular intervals now, sometimes faster, sometimes with long pauses, like the person outside was trying combinations systematically, methodically, testing every possible code. My mind raced with the realization that the person either knew there was a code or had a plan to force their way in. The beep stopped for a moment. Then came the sound of a heel striking the door. Not once, not twice, but several times, hard enough to make the door shudder. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my legs weak. My first instinct was to run, but where could I run to? The townhouse was narrow, the stairs behind me, the front door under attack. I backed away from the banister and moved toward the bedroom at the end of the hall. My mind raced through options. The complex was gated, so the person outside couldn't have approached from a random street, at least not easily, but the thought of someone out there, waiting and trying to get in, was enough to make my stomach turn. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained my location. The operator reassured me that officers were on their way. I stayed on the line, whispering updates whenever I heard another beep or a knock, my ears straining for any sign of movement. Minutes stretched in a way that made time feel like it had thickened, slowed. Every small noise downstairs made me flinch. The beeps came again, softer this time, almost teasing, before stopping abruptly. Then came the silence, heavy and pressing. My imagination ran wild with possibilities. Maybe they had a tool. Maybe they were trying to watch me through a window. Maybe they had been waiting for this moment for hours, studying the complex, my co-workers' habits, and now it was me. I moved to the bedroom window and pulled back the curtain slightly, careful not to be seen. The yard outside was empty, dark except for the glow of a streetlight at the far end of the alley. Nothing moved, not even a shadow. I exhaled slowly, but the relief was fleeting. I could still hear the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sirens outside, but no sign of anyone. I tried to focus, telling myself I needed to stay calm, to make a plan in case the person returned. I checked the bedroom door, then the closet, then back to the window. I considered barricading myself inside, but the door was flimsy, and the hallway beyond offered no cover if someone broke in. My only options were to stay put and wait for help, or make a run for it to a neighbor's townhouse if the intruder left. About 10 minutes passed with nothing, then suddenly, the keypad beeps returned. 4 quick presses again. Beep, 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 beep. Pause. And again. My stomach dropped. The person hadn't left. They were still outside. I realized with a sinking feeling that they might have been trying all night to get the code, or they knew the usual patterns people used, and were counting on someone panicking and giving it away. I remembered that the front door had a small peephole. I moved carefully, trying not to make a sound, and looked through it. At first, nothing. Then I saw a faint silhouette of a person, crouched slightly, hand near the keypad, moving in a calculated way. Their face was hidden in shadow, but the intent was clear. They were trying to get in. My chest tightened, and I felt my hands shake. I remembered the spare keys my coworker had hidden in the garden for emergencies, but the thought of going outside, in that moment, made me dizzy with fear. I couldn't risk it. I had to wait. I had to stay alive. I moved back to the bedroom, keeping my phone clutched tightly. Every few seconds, I would glance at the door, expecting it to give way at any moment. After what felt like an eternity, the beep stopped. The silence was oppressive. I stayed where I was, holding my breath, until I thought I could hear footsteps retreating down the alley. My stomach loosened slightly, though I didn't dare relax completely. I stayed on the phone with 911 until the police arrived, watching through the window as their patrol car pulled up and 2 officers got out, flashlights sweeping the area. They searched the perimeter and confirmed there was no one lingering. The officers reassured me that the area was secure, but they stressed that the person may have been watching from a distance, waiting for an opportunity. One officer suggested changing the lock code immediately, which I did before leaving the townhouse, making sure the new code was unpredictable. I spent the rest of the night at a nearby friend's apartment, unable to sleep, replaying the events over and over in my head. Every sound in the street, every shadow in my peripheral vision, kept me on edge. It was a long night full of adrenaline, fear, and the chilling realization that someone had been out there, knowing how to get in, testing me, observing me. In the morning, I returned to the townhouse with my coworker, who was shocked at what had happened. We went through the house, checking locks, alarms, and windows, making sure everything was secure. The police filed a report, and I took detailed notes for my own records. We even installed a small security camera above the door, so that if anything like that ever happened again, there would be a clear record. That experience stayed with me for months. Every time I approached a keypad or entered an unfamiliar house, I felt the same tightening in my chest, the same prickling awareness that someone could be watching, waiting for a moment of weakness. I became hyper-aware of small details, the pattern of the wind through the trees, the sounds of distant footsteps, the faint glow of lights in windows. I learned that fear isn't always about what you see. Sometimes it's about what might be out there, quietly, patiently calculating. And sometimes the best defense is simply staying calm, waiting for help, and making sure the locks are changed. The incident taught me caution in a way I never expected, and while the memory is terrifying, it also reminded me that careful thinking and patience can carry you through moments of real danger. Even now, whenever I think back to that night in Austin, I can still hear the beeps in my head, the green glow of the keypad, the muffled curses, and the heavy pounding of my own heart. It's a sound that reminds me of just how close fear can get, and how quickly ordinary moments can turn into something life-changing. I remember the night like it was happening all over again, even though it's been years. It was July 2021, and my parents had gone up to Flagstaff for the weekend, leaving me alone in our suburban Phoenix house. The place was a single-story ranch, sprawling enough to feel safe most of the time, but empty and silent at night. It could feel oddly exposed. I had grown up here, and I knew every creak and hum of the house, every corner and shadow. But that night, nothing familiar felt right. I woke up sometime after 3 a.m., my throat dry from the heat. July nights in Phoenix barely offered relief. The air was heavy, sticking to my skin like a damp blanket. I rolled out of bed, careful not to wake the dog. They weren't home, but my parents had left instructions for me to keep the house quiet. The floor was cool beneath my bare feet, the kind of tile that could make your toes ache if you moved too quickly across it. I shuffled toward the kitchen, letting my eyes adjust to the dark, moving along the walls where I knew the layout by heart. Every shadow seemed sharper than it should be, every creak of the house sounding amplified in the stillness. I reached the kitchen, my hand brushing along the counter as I opened the cabinet for a glass. Just as my fingers closed around it, the motion sensor floodlight above the sliding glass door clicked on with a deafening snap. The sudden whiteness of it blinded me for a second, and my heart slammed hard enough that I felt it in my throat. The backyard was drenched in harsh, sterile light, every detail revealed. The patio chairs, the small table, the cinderblock wall at the edge of the yard, even the faint outline of weeds sprouting between the stones. At first, I saw nothing unusual. I was about to breathe a shaky sigh, telling myself it was probably just a stray cat or some wind moving a branch. Then I noticed it, the detail that made my stomach sink and my pulse triple. One of the patio chairs, the one my dad always sat in when he came out in the evenings with a cold beer, was turned slightly toward the sliding glass door. It hadn't been like that when I went to bed, not a fraction of a degree. I froze, the glass of water halfway to my mouth, and my eyes scanned the concrete just in front of the chair. There they were, 2 clear shoe prints in the dust, toes pointing directly at me, right where I was standing. Heavy, solid prints. Recent. Not faint. Someone had been out there. I didn't move. I couldn't. My brain screamed for me to grab the phone, call 911, scream, anything, but the room felt suddenly too small, too hot, too quiet aside from the buzz of the refrigerator. My body ached with indecision, fear gripping my chest like a vice. I could see the outline of the shoes perfectly, even the slight dust that had been disturbed around the edges, as if the person had stepped lightly after standing there for a moment. I swallowed hard, the dry air scratching my throat. Every instinct I had told me that the person wasn't still out there. They would have triggered the sensor again if they moved. And yet, the fact that the chair was moved, and the prints, so clear, made my skin crawl. I couldn't tell if the person had been watching the house, or if they'd just been careless, stepping out into the backyard without thinking about the sensor. But it didn't feel random. It felt like someone had been there, had stood quietly, observing me sleeping, and then moved off into the shadows. I backed away from the door slowly, my eyes never leaving the backyard. The floodlight stayed on, casting everything in stark, unflinching white. I moved toward the kitchen drawer, fumbled for my phone. My hands were shaking, and when I finally held it, the screen glared back at me in the dark, offering a faint comfort. I unlocked it, trying not to make a sound, and opened the camera app. My first thought was to try to take a picture of the prints. I thought it might help police later, or at least give me some proof. But my hands were trembling too much, the angle too difficult, and I realized I couldn't do it without moving dangerously close to the sliding door. I set the phone down on the counter, and that's when I noticed the other details. The gate at the side of the yard, which was usually closed and latched, was slightly ajar. The latch itself hadn't been moved, so the gate hadn't been forced, but the fact that it was open meant someone could have slipped through quietly, moving around the house in the dark. My pulse raced even faster, and I realized that I had been lucky the floodlight had gone off at all. It probably scared them enough to step back. I debated calling the police, but I hated the idea of them showing up and finding nothing, leaving me looking paranoid. My parents had always drilled into me to be calm, rational, and to handle small emergencies myself. But this wasn't small. This wasn't a faint noise in the attic or a raccoon in the trash. This was someone in my yard, possibly watching me, possibly waiting. The thought that they might still be close, maybe hiding somewhere just out of sight, made me want to run upstairs and lock myself in my room, but I couldn't move too quickly, not yet. I moved silently back to the living room, keeping the floodlight in view through the large picture window that looked out over the backyard. I grabbed a baseball bat that I kept by the couch for old habits, my dad's idea, more for show than real protection, but something solid nonetheless. I held it loosely in my hands, my knuckles white from the tension, and I tried to make a plan. I couldn't stay in the kitchen. I couldn't risk walking past the sliding door again, but I needed to make sure no one was inside the house. I crept through the living room, keeping my eyes on the backyard the whole time. Every shadow inside the house seemed darker now, every corner a potential hiding place. I checked each room as quietly as I could, listening for any unusual sounds. Nothing, just the normal hum of the AC and the distant buzz of the city that never sleeps. I made my way back to my room, thinking I would barricade the door and wait for morning. But as I passed the hallway, I caught a movement in the corner of my eye, something fast, fleeting, near the side window that faced the front yard. I froze, holding my breath. The street was dark, the landscaping shadows deep, and for a second I thought I saw someone duck behind the neighbor's car. Then nothing, just the swaying branches and the flicker of a streetlight down the block. That's when my rational brain started working cold and sharp. The person in my backyard couldn't have gone far. They would have had to leave through the gate, which was open. The side yard led to the front, and I could see the street from my window. If someone had gone that way, I might be able to catch a glimpse of them leaving. I grabbed my phone again, dialing 911 this time, my voice barely above a whisper as I gave the address, my hands trembling so badly that I kept dropping the phone slightly before catching it. The operator's calm voice on the other end was grounding, even though my own body felt like it was vibrating with adrenaline. I told them someone had been in my backyard, that I was home alone, and that I didn't know if they were still around. I stayed on the line, quietly explaining everything, and I could hear their reassurance as they promised to send officers immediately. I didn't dare move back toward the sliding glass door. I watched the backyard from my living room window, keeping the floodlight in view. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Time felt distorted. Every creak, every small noise made my heart jump. Eventually, I saw a flash of movement at the side gate, the same gate that had been ajar, and a shadow moved past it quickly, disappearing toward the street. I couldn't see the person's face, but the outline was unmistakable, an adult, moving fast, careful to stay in the shadows. I breathed a little easier, but I didn't relax. The police were on the way, and I didn't want to give them a chance to slip back in. When the officers arrived, they parked outside, their lights cutting through the dark. They asked me to show them the backyard, and I led them quietly, pointing out the chair, the prints, the slightly open gate. They examined everything carefully, nodding, taking notes, shining flashlights across the yard. The prints were still visible, the chair still turned just slightly toward the house. They couldn't find anyone, of course, and they reminded me to lock the gate and doors, check all points of entry, and remain vigilant. One of the officers suggested that the person might have been scoping the house, looking for an easy target, and had probably left once the light went on. That didn't calm me much. The idea that someone had been so close, so deliberate, made my skin crawl. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room, bat in hand, phone on my lap, watching the house and waiting for daylight. I didn't sleep, only dozed lightly, ears straining for any sound. When the morning came, sunlight spilled across the yard, and everything looked normal again, the terror of the night retreating but leaving a residue of unease. I examined the backyard again, walking slowly among the chairs and concrete. The prints had faded slightly overnight, but I could still make out their shapes. I cleaned the patio thoroughly, locked every gate, and added extra lights to the yard, just in case. That weekend left a mark on me. I stopped feeling completely safe in the house, even with the floodlights and locked doors. Every creak, every movement outside, set my nerves on edge. I realized how close danger could get without warning, how normal, quiet nights could turn threatening in seconds. The incident made me more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, and more respectful of the fragility of safety when you're alone. I never found out exactly who had been there that night or why, but the memory of those prints, the chair turned toward the glass, and the harsh white light of the floodlight stayed with me, a constant reminder that reality doesn't need ghosts or fairy tales to terrify you. It only needs someone willing to step silently into the dark. I was alone in my apartment that night, the kind of quiet that presses down on you like a weight you can't shake. The building I lived in was old, the kind where the pipes rumbled at odd hours and the wooden floors creaked with the memory of every step ever taken on them. I had just moved in a few months ago, drawn in by the cheap rent and the view of the alley below, which was narrow and shadowed by the walls of neighboring buildings. I didn't mind the age of the place, not until that night, when it suddenly felt like the walls themselves were watching me. I had been editing photos at my desk for hours, the glow of the computer screen painting my face in pale blue. Outside, the night was heavy and still. The streetlights flickered occasionally, their dim pools of light barely reaching the alley. Sometimes, I would hear a distant car or the muffled bark of a dog, but mostly it was silence, the kind of silence that fills the lungs and makes your own heartbeat seem deafening. I was tired but satisfied, scrolling through images, adjusting exposure and contrast, feeling the quiet focus of the work pull me deeper into a private world where nothing could touch me. The apartment was small but comfortable. My desk was pushed against the window, facing out toward the alley. The blinds were open, though the room was dark except for the glow of the screen. I had always liked working with the window behind me, thinking it gave me light to balance the harshness of the monitor. Now though, I realized it left me exposed. The thought flitted through my mind briefly, like a shadow on the corner of my awareness, but I brushed it off. There was nothing to worry about. I was on the 4th floor. No one could just reach this window. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. Editing for hours always left them dry and sore. I decided to check my face with the front camera on my phone, just a quick glance to make sure I wasn't a pale zombie staring back at the screen. I flipped the phone and tapped the camera. The image appeared and I froze. It wasn't me that made me stop breathing. It was the reflection behind me, in the darkened window, the black mirror of the night. There was the outline of a head pressed against the glass, just at my eye level. I could make out the curve of a skull, the shoulders hunched, the way it seemed to lean in just slightly, almost testing the strength of the pain. My blood ran cold. I could feel it rushing through my veins, the warmth of fear climbing up my spine. I didn't breathe, didn't move. Then, as if someone had stepped back, it was gone. The reflection was empty again, only the faint shapes of my apartment visible in the blackness. I blinked, convinced I had imagined it, my brain trying to rationalize what I had seen. My logical side told me maybe it was a trick of the light, maybe my eyes were tired, maybe shadows in the alley were reflecting strangely. But deep down, I knew the shape I had seen. I had not imagined the way the head had pressed so deliberately against the glass, the way it had hovered for a fraction of a second before vanishing. I told myself to calm down. I set the phone down and turned slowly in my chair, trying to see through the window without moving too quickly, not wanting to panic myself further. The alley was empty, silent. The dim streetlight at the far end swayed slightly as the wind moved it, casting long, thin shadows across the brick walls. I strained my eyes, searching for anything, any movement, but there was nothing. Nothing that should have been there, anyway. My apartment felt suddenly too small, the walls too close, the ceiling pressing down. I tried to focus on my work again, telling myself it was over, that it had been a trick of the night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I could feel it in my bones, the prickling sensation that crawls up your neck when your body knows something your mind doesn't yet understand. I stood up, telling myself I was just going to close the blinds. A simple action, ordinary, meant to make me feel safer. The blinds were thin, flimsy, but they would at least give me the comfort of knowing no one could peer in. As I reached for the cord, I froze again. Outside the window, at the very edge of the shadows, I saw it. The faintest movement, just a dark shape slipping out of the alley, hugging the walls like it didn't want to be seen. I couldn't make out features, not from this distance, but the motion was deliberate, slow, and careful, like someone moving just out of reach. My hands trembled. I wanted to look away, wanted to convince myself it was just a cat or a rat, but I couldn't. I watched, frozen, as it disappeared into the darker recesses of the alley, leaving nothing but the shifting shadows behind. I closed the blinds quickly and locked them, double-checking the latch. The apartment was quiet again, but my chest felt tight, my breathing shallow. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that it was a building full of shadows and my mind playing tricks. But the image of that head pressed against the glass stayed in my mind, burned into my memory with such clarity I could still feel the pressure of it in my own skull. I sat back down at my desk, my hands hovering over the keyboard. The screen seemed unbearably bright now, every reflection exaggerated, every shadow in the room more pronounced. I turned on a lamp, placing it behind me, illuminating the room so the window was no longer a dark mirror. I stared out at the alley, trying to convince myself it was over. Hours passed. The world outside remained silent, but I didn't move from the desk. I didn't trust myself to. My photos remained open, edits half finished, as I sat there in the uneasy glow of the lamp, staring at the window and imagining shapes in the darkness. At some point, sleep came, reluctant and uneasy, dragging me under despite the tension in my body. When I woke, it was early morning. Sunlight was spilling into the apartment, and the world outside looked harmless, ordinary. I checked the window again, eyes scanning for anything out of place, but it was just the alley, quiet and empty. Still, I couldn't shake the memory. I went about my day, but something in me had changed. Every time I passed the window, I felt the same prickling sensation, the feeling that I was being watched. I installed a small camera facing the alley, a cheap security measure that gave me some comfort, some small control over the unknown. I told myself it would record everything, and I could watch the footage if I needed to, convince myself that there was nothing to fear. That night, I was editing photos again, desk lamp on, blinds closed. The apartment was quiet. The hum of my computer was the only sound. I remembered the head, the outline in the window, and my stomach twisted. I glanced toward the camera I had installed. The screen displayed the alley outside, empty and bathed in the dim glow of the streetlight. Nothing moved. Nothing at all. I leaned back, breathing heavily, and then I noticed it. A shadow, flickering at the edge of the camera's field of view, just outside the alley, where the light didn't fully reach. I squinted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I grabbed my phone, checked the live feed from the security app, and froze. The shadow had shifted closer, closer to the building, to the bottom of the fire escape. My pulse spiked. I realized the person, whoever they were, had been there the entire time, hidden in the dark, watching. I called the police immediately. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped the phone. I gave them my address and explained the situation as best I could, describing the shadow on the feed, the previous incident at the window. They said they would send someone right away. I didn't wait. I checked all the locks in the apartment, doors and windows, triple-checking each latch. I moved heavy furniture in front of the windows, just in case. Every sound made me jump, the pipes rattling, the faint hum of the heater, the creak of the floor under my own weight. It felt like hours before they arrived, but it was probably only 20 minutes. 2 officers showed up, flashlights cutting through the shadows outside. They examined the building, checked the alley, questioned neighbors. In the end, they found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no footprints in the alley, no one hiding. They reassured me that it was likely someone passing through or a prank, though the tone of their voice suggested they weren't entirely convinced either. I couldn't go back to normal. The apartment that had once felt like a safe space now felt like a trap. I packed my essentials that night, deciding I couldn't stay. I found a small place on the second floor of a newer building, with modern locks and no alley behind the windows. Moving was exhausting, but it was necessary. Even now, months later, I check my windows when it's dark, every shadow putting me on edge. The memory of that head pressed against the glass is burned into me, a reminder that the world can intrude in the quietest places, that the sense of safety can vanish in a heartbeat. But I survived. I learned to trust my instincts, to notice what doesn't belong. I don't look at my old apartment anymore. I don't even drive past it. Sometimes I still wonder who it was, who had been watching me from the alley behind the old building. The police never found anyone, never explained the shadow. But I know what I saw. I know it was real. And I know that when you are alone, you have to protect yourself, because no one else will. When I first moved into the studio in downtown Portland, it felt like stepping into a new life. The building was old, a brick structure from the 1940s with narrow hallways that smelled faintly of damp cement and old wood polish. I had the 8th floor, which gave me a view of the city's rainy streets below and the occasional neon sign flickering in the fog. The apartment itself was small, barely more than a single room, but it had character. Exposed brick walls, a high ceiling with a single ceiling fan that wobbled when it spun, and windows that rattled slightly whenever the wind picked up. I hadn't even fully unpacked yet. Most of my things were still in boxes stacked awkwardly in corners, and my mattress sat directly on the floor because I hadn't bought a bed frame. The space felt empty, echoing with the faint sounds of the city outside. That first week, I was exhausted, moving from shift to shift at work and barely taking the time to settle in. I was living out of boxes, clothes scattered, dishes stacked precariously in the tiny kitchen area. On my 3rd night, it was raining heavily. Portland rain has a way of swallowing sound, muting the city while amplifying the wet, hollow sound of water dripping and cars splashing past the streets below. I had just gotten home from a late shift, the sky dark and the streets glossy with rain. I fumbled with my keys, cold and wet, and finally unlocked the door. I stepped inside, hearing the faint groan of the old hinges, locked it behind me, and dropped my keys on the counter. The apartment was quiet except for the occasional hum of the radiator kicking in and the patter of rain against the windows. Across from where I had set up my mattress was a sliding closet. I had left it half open when I moved in, my coats and a few boxes of shoes stuffed inside. I remembered thinking at the time that it might be easier to leave it open until I unpacked completely, though now, as I settled under my blanket, I noticed that the door wasn't quite as closed as I remembered. But I told myself it was nothing, just a draft, the old building settling, or maybe I hadn't pushed it fully. I lay on the mattress scrolling through my phone, the room dimly lit by the screen and a small lamp I had plugged in earlier. It was around 11:20 p.m. when I heard the faint sound first. It was soft, almost imperceptible, the gentle clink of plastic hangers shifting against each other. I froze, listening. The sound stopped, then started again, slower this time, deliberate. My heart kicked up a notch, but I told myself it was probably just the heating kicking in, or my jacket brushing against the others, making the hangers move. Old apartments make noise at night, I told myself. I tried to laugh quietly at my own nerves, hoping the sound wouldn't repeat. Then my phone buzzed. A notification from Google Photos. "Rediscover this day," it said. I tapped it, expecting some mundane old picture of a meal or a friend I hadn't thought about in months. But the first image that appeared made me freeze. It was grainy, dark, and obviously taken from chest height, the angle awkward as if the person holding it had been standing over me while I slept. At the bottom of the frame, I could see my mattress, my blanket, and the back of my own head. Above that, the closet. Its sliding door, which I had left barely ajar, was now open just a little wider than it had been a minute before. My stomach dropped. I didn't move at first. I stared at the image, my fingers gripping the phone so tightly it started to hurt. I swiped to see if it was part of a series, but there were no more pictures. Just that single image. My pulse was loud in my ears, and I felt the blanket stick to my skin from nervous sweat. I told myself it must be a glitch, maybe a leftover image from someone else's account accidentally synced. But a part of me couldn't shake the dread crawling up my spine. I decided to put the phone down, but the second my hand left it, I heard it again, the soft rattle of hangers. Slow, deliberate. Not a gust of wind, not the heating. Something was moving inside the closet. My hands shook, and I forced myself to sit up. The apartment felt suddenly smaller, the walls pressing in. Every instinct screamed at me to get up, run, call someone. But I didn't move immediately. I just watched. The closet door had shifted again. Just a fraction this time, but enough that my brain registered it. I could see the dark line of space between the door and the wall. I reached for my phone, heart hammering, fingers fumbling as I opened the flashlight app. I didn't make a sound. I trained the light on the closet. Empty. Just my coats hanging there. I told myself to breathe. Old building, noises, shadows, imagination. I ran through everything I could think of that would explain it. But the feeling didn't leave. Every second the silence stretched, the more my mind imagined the worst. I scanned the rest of the room with the light, the boxes, the walls, the windows. Nothing moved. Nothing shifted. Only the closet. The door stayed half open. I forced myself to get up. My bare feet hit the cold hardwood floor. I moved slowly, almost crawling, toward the closet, the phone shaking in front of me. I had no weapon, nothing but my own fear and the flimsy blanket I had left behind. I reached the door and grabbed the edge. With as much control as I could muster, I yanked it fully open. Nothing. Just the jackets, my boots, the couple of boxes shoved to the side. I exhaled, slow and loud, trying to convince myself I was safe. Maybe it had been the wind. Maybe a hanger had just shifted in a weird way. I sat back on the mattress, trying to shake off the feeling. But then I noticed something new. On the floor, in the corner near the back wall, a single footprint, muddy, wet, and too large to be mine. I hadn't stepped out of the shoes I was wearing. I always removed them at the door. My blood ran cold. The footprint led from the closet toward the small kitchenette, then stopped abruptly. There was no other mark anywhere in the apartment. I knew I had to leave, but leaving wasn't simple. I lived alone, on the 8th floor of an old building, with no one awake at this hour. I grabbed my jacket, threw my phone and keys into it, and stepped into the hallway. The building was silent except for the soft hum of the heating and the distant city noise far below. I didn't look back. I moved quickly, taking the stairwell instead of the elevator. Each step creaked under my weight. The idea of someone being inside my apartment terrified me. I didn't return to my apartment that night. I stayed at a 24-hour diner a few blocks away, sipping coffee, my jacket pulled tightly around me. My mind raced, replaying every detail, every sound. I didn't sleep. I didn't go back until morning, and when I did, I called a locksmith. Every lock was replaced, including the old sliding lock on the closet. Nothing had been taken, nothing had moved. I packed the rest of my belongings quickly after that, and I never stayed in that studio again. To this day, I have no explanation for what I saw in that photo, what the sound in the closet was, or how a footprint appeared without me noticing anyone enter. I don't live downtown anymore, and I don't keep photos stored in the cloud in the same way. But sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet apartment and hear the faintest sound of plastic shifting in a dark closet, I remember that night, the rain against the windows, and the photo that showed me someone had been watching while I slept. I've learned to trust the instincts your mind sends when something feels wrong, and I've learned to never ignore a small, quiet sound in an empty room. Even now, I can't shake the thought that the person in that apartment could have been standing just out of frame, just behind me, and I might never have known if Google Photos hadn't shown me what was already there. I don't live downtown anymore, and I've tried to convince myself that it was just some glitch, some mistake, but the footprint, the shifting hangers, the way the closet door moved, those things stick with me. They are real. I had always considered myself someone who could handle being alone. The condo in San Diego was cozy, nothing fancy, but it felt safe. It was on the ground floor, with a sliding glass door leading to a small patio and a view of the neighboring courtyard. My partner had left on a work trip for a week, and I was perfectly fine with a few nights to myself. That evening, late September 2018, I had finished some work emails and settled into bed with my laptop, watching random videos that I didn't even fully pay attention to. The air conditioning hummed softly in the background, keeping the temperature perfect, and the faint sound of traffic from the street outside drifted through the partially open window. I remember thinking how quiet it was for a Friday night. Around 12:30 a.m., I was starting to doze, the kind of half-sleep where you are aware of your surroundings, but can't summon the energy to react. That's when I heard it. A soft click, followed by a muted beep. My brain froze for a fraction of a second. I recognized the sound instantly. It was the microwave. I had turned it off hours earlier, had even checked it when I made some tea. I stared at the bedroom doorway, my eyes adjusting to the dim glow of the streetlight filtering through the blinds. The microwave was in the kitchen, maybe 20 feet away, but the sound was unmistakable. The door opening, the control panel chiming. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe I had left it partially open. Maybe a timer had somehow gone off. But nothing made sense. I had used the microwave earlier that day. I knew how it behaved. The low hum started next, almost immediately after the click and beep. The microwave was running. For 3 seconds, it hummed quietly. Then it stopped. No beep to signal the end, no flashing numbers. Nothing. Silence. Every muscle in my body locked. My heart started hammering in my chest. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe loudly. I lay there, straining my ears. The condo was otherwise silent. No footsteps, no cabinets opening or closing, no rustling. Just the faint ticking of the kitchen clock and the deep thrum of my own heartbeat. My mind raced through possibilities. I thought about the security latch on the sliding door, but it was firmly in place. The main door was locked. There was no one inside. At least, there shouldn't be. I had a flashlight on my nightstand, and my first instinct was to grab it and check the kitchen. My rational side told me to stay put, to maybe call someone, but the thought of moving made me feel exposed. I remember the darkness in the hallway feeling heavier than it had before, like it was a presence of its own. My eyes strained to see anything, but the dim glow from the streetlight barely reached the doorway. The microwave's small light on its display remained dark, silent, and still. My mind kept looping back to that impossible fact. There was no way it could have started by itself. At least, not under normal circumstances. Eventually, I summoned the courage to get out of bed. Every step toward the hallway felt like it amplified the silence around me. The carpet muffled my movements, but even that didn't help with the growing sense of being watched. I reached the threshold and shined the flashlight into the kitchen. Everything looked normal. The countertops were clear, the chairs pushed in, the fridge closed, the sink empty. I wanted to laugh at myself, wanted to tell myself I was imagining things. But the microwave had just turned itself on. That wasn't imagination. I moved closer. The microwave was untouched, the door firmly shut. I pressed a button to see if it would react. Nothing. The buttons worked, just as they should. I tried a few combinations, watched the display light up. Nothing unusual. And yet, the memory of it starting without my touch lingered like a weight pressing down on me. I backed away slowly, my flashlight beam scanning the rest of the condo. Living room, no movement. Patio, no shadows. Bedroom, still empty. Everything looked exactly as it should. But the feeling of unease had settled over me like a second skin. I tried to reason through it again. Maybe an electrical glitch. Maybe a delayed power surge. My mind struggled to find a logical explanation, but the event had been too precise. The click, the beep, the hum starting exactly as it had. I decided to check all the doors again. Sliding door locked. Main door locked. Windows secure. I even checked the fire escape ladder. Nothing. Then I started thinking about the layout of the condo. Ground floor, easy access. If someone wanted to get in, they could. But the locks were simple, functional, and secure. No signs of tampering. My mind refused to accept the truth, that I could have been vulnerable without knowing it. I decided I couldn't go back to bed yet. I walked through the living room, flashlight sweeping across every corner. My eyes kept darting to shadows, to places where light couldn't reach. The patio door blinds were slightly uneven, like someone had brushed against them. My stomach tightened, but I didn't touch them. I didn't want to acknowledge it. Then I did something I hadn't wanted to do. I checked the closets. One by one, I opened them slowly, flashlight inside, scanning every corner. Nothing. My partner's side of the closet, empty. Mine, empty. Laundry room, pantry, everything. Empty. But the sense of presence didn't leave. I could feel it in the air, just outside the reach of the light, just beyond the edge of perception. I decided to sit in the living room for a while, to let my mind calm down. The flashlight rested on the coffee table, illuminating the room. The microwave was quiet again. My laptop was still open, videos paused. The AC hummed in the background. Outside, the street was quiet. I told myself I was safe, that I was alone, that nothing had actually happened besides a glitch. Hours passed. I stayed awake, watching, listening. Every creak of the building, every distant car, every hum of the streetlight felt magnified. I began to notice details I hadn't before, the faint smell of takeout from earlier, the subtle draft near the front door, the way shadows moved with the wind outside. I made mental notes of every sound, every flicker of light. Eventually, I forced myself back into bed, flashlight in hand, eyes open, ears straining. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the microwave humming again. I imagined footsteps in the hallway. I imagined a shadow lingering just out of reach. Morning felt impossibly far away, but I clung to the thought that sunlight would bring clarity, would make the condo feel normal again. When the first light of dawn finally seeped through the blinds, I got up carefully, walking through the condo once more. Every surface, every corner, every door, I checked it all. Everything was as it should be. No evidence of intrusion, no signs that anyone had been there. I even unplugged the microwave and checked it for any faults. Mechanically, it was fine. No explanation. I called my partner, told them everything. They didn't dismiss it, just reminded me to stay cautious, to keep doors locked, to call the police if I felt unsafe. I didn't call the police. There was no crime yet. There was no evidence. But the unease lingered. For weeks afterward, every small noise in the condo made me tense. Every hum, every click, every sound from the kitchen reminded me of that night. I installed extra locks, a security camera, and a motion-sensitive light outside the sliding door. I never saw anyone, never heard anything else like it, but I never forgot it either. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't a ghost. It was just someone, or something, having the ability to be there without me noticing. That realization changed the way I saw being alone. And in the quiet, still condo, even years later, I can still hear that soft click, that muted beep, and feel every muscle in my body lock as if it were happening again. I moved into the top floor of the old Victorian row house on a cold December evening in 2016. The building was narrow and tall, wedged between two others that looked almost identical from the outside. The front stoop was chipped, the paint peeling, and the iron railing bent in several places. But it had character, the kind of place that made you feel like you were living in history, not just an apartment. I'd rented it because it was cheap, and the landlord had said it was fully safe, even though the neighborhood could feel empty and sharp at night. The stairwell leading up to my apartment was steep and narrow, the kind that made you hold onto the railing as you climbed, especially when carrying groceries. The bottom door was heavy, made of thick wood, and it locked automatically. That fact gave me a strange comfort and a little unease at the same time. You could secure yourself in, but if someone got past that door, there was nowhere to run. That Friday night, I got home just before midnight. Snow had started falling lightly outside, dusting the streets in white and making the streetlights shimmer. I unlocked the bottom door, the iron bolt scraping against the frame, and the door swung closed behind me with a heavy thud that echoed up the stairwell. I could hear the faint hum of the radiator above me as I climbed the stairs, my boots squeaking against the worn wooden steps. I had groceries in one hand, a bag with ingredients for pasta, and I tried to keep my balance as I made the final climb to my apartment. Inside, the place smelled faintly of old wood and dust, with the lingering scent of last tenants cooking. The ceilings were high, with intricate crown moldings, and the floorboards creaked beneath my feet as if the building itself were warning me to move carefully. I unpacked my groceries, set a pot of water on the stove, and boiled pasta. The apartment was silent except for the faint hiss of the radiator and the occasional creak of the floorboards settling. The heater kicked in with a soft thump, sending a wave of warmth that made me feel safe, cocooned in my small top-floor apartment while the city lay cold and quiet below. After dinner, I watched YouTube for a while, leaning back in my chair, the laptop balanced on my knees. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly, rattling the window panes, and I imagined the streets empty, silent, save for the occasional car passing under the orange glow of the streetlights. Around 2 a.m., I turned off the laptop, brushed my teeth, and crawled into bed, pulling the blanket tightly around me. I liked sleeping with the window slightly cracked despite the cold. The air smelled faintly of snow and the city outside, clean and sharp. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the quiet hum of the radiator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. I woke sometime later, though I didn't know exactly how long I'd been asleep. At first, I thought the sound was the radiator again, a slow, rhythmic whooshing, almost mechanical. It took me a full minute to realize it wasn't mechanical at all. It sounded like someone breathing. Calm, steady breaths, almost deliberate, and coming from the hallway just outside my bedroom door. My heart began to pound, slow at first, then fast, thudding against my chest like a drum. I lay completely still, straining to hear. The breathing was quiet but distinct, close enough that I could hear the faint intake and release of air through someone's nose. Whoever it was had been standing there a while. I wanted to scream, to run, but the rational part of me told myself it had to be impossible. I had locked the heavy door at the bottom of the stairs. No one could be inside the building without me knowing. And yet, the sound was real. I reached for my phone, hands shaking so badly that I nearly dropped it. My eyes adjusted to the dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of streetlights through the window. The phone read 3:18 a.m. Then came a creak, sharp and deliberate, right outside the door. Someone had stepped forward, and the breathing stopped. Silence filled the hallway, thick and heavy. My body felt frozen. I tried to tell myself it was a dream, or that I'd imagined the breathing. But my instincts screamed at me that wasn't the case. I forced myself out of bed, moving as quietly as I could. My apartment wasn't big, but the layout made it feel like a maze in the dark. I could see the hallway leading from my bedroom to the living room, and I could feel a cold draft coming from the small crack in the front window. I edged toward the door, listening for any sound. Nothing. I pressed my ear to the doorframe, trying to hear through the thin walls. The hallway was empty. I could see faint outlines of the walls, the coat rack, and the narrow staircase leading to the lower floors. No one was there. My rational mind tried to grasp it. Maybe it was a neighbor in the building, though that made little sense. They were supposed to be asleep, and the front door was locked. Maybe it was the wind, but no wind could mimic the sound of human breathing so perfectly. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and started down the hallway. The beam shook as my hands trembled, casting long, eerie shadows against the walls. I checked every corner, every shadow, every doorway. The apartment was empty. I crept to the front door, listening for anything, every nerve on edge. My breath came in quick, shallow bursts. I examined the lock, intact. The heavy wooden door was locked tight. No signs of forced entry. I even checked the windows, double-locked, nothing out of place. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room, flashlight in hand, ears straining at every sound. The breathing never returned. Occasionally, I would hear a floorboard creak, a distant thump from outside, or the faint hiss of the radiator, and my heart would jump into my throat. I stayed that way until dawn, watching the first weak light filter through the window. By mid-morning, exhaustion forced me to collapse on the couch. The apartment was silent again, peaceful almost, but the memory of the breathing clung to me, a tight knot in my chest. I called the landlord and explained what had happened. He was sympathetic but firm. The building's old. Floorboards creak. Pipes make noises. You're fine. I wanted to believe him, but something about the sound had been too precise, too human. I spent the next few nights hyper-aware of every noise. I installed an extra lock on the door, double-checked the windows, and even moved a chair under the doorknob at night. Every creak made me flinch. Every gust of wind through the cracked window made me tense. I never saw anyone. No signs, no footprints, nothing to prove what had happened. It was terrifying in its ambiguity. Someone could have been there, or maybe I had imagined it, but the certainty of the breathing haunted me. Weeks passed. I got into a routine, convincing myself it had been a combination of stress, loneliness, and an overactive imagination. Still, I never opened that bottom door at night without checking the stairs and the lock 3 times. I never slept with the window cracked again. And while the apartment was cozy, warm, and filled with light during the day, at night it felt like a different place entirely, narrow, shadowed, full of sounds that didn't belong. I eventually moved out the following spring, unable to shake the sense that someone had been inside, someone watching me, breathing quietly while I slept. Even after leaving, I could recall the sound so vividly that I could hear it if I closed my eyes. I never found out if it was real, if it was a trespasser, or if my mind had played a cruel trick on me. What I do know is that when I think back to that night, the fear doesn't come from shadows or ghosts. It comes from the certainty that someone had been close enough to touch me, just standing there, and I had never seen them. The sense of proximity, the intimacy of the breathing, is what stayed with me, sharper than any story or explanation could ever be.